I want you to take a second and just picture a skyline.
Cool.
When you want to know if a building is impressive, you usually look up, right? You look at how tall it is, the glittering glass facade, or, the penthouse suite at the very top.
Right, yeah. The view everyone wants.
Exactly. But if a magnitude 8 earthquake suddenly hits, well, nobody cares about the penthouse view.
No, definitely not.
You only care about one thing, the foundation. And I want you to keep that in mind because today I want you to guess which country is best positioned to survive the compounding global crises of the next 10 years.
It's funny because most people immediately jump to the superpowers. They look at the global penthouse, so to speak.
Naturally, you'd probably guess the United States, or maybe China, or, an industrial powerhouse like Germany.
Yeah, but if you look past that glittering facade and actually dig into the foundation, it's none of those.
It's really not. According to a massive composite analysis of structural data that we are doing a deep dive into today, the answer is actually Norway.
Right. A nation of just 5 million people with, well, virtually no military ambitions to speak of.
It's wild. It completely upends the conventional map of global power.
It really does. The countries we usually think of as, running the world aren't necessarily the ones built to survive its most turbulent moments.
So today, our mission on this deep dive is to extract the most critical insights from a massive stack of sources. We've got intelligence briefings, structural audits, and the latest economic data from the IMF and the World Bank.
A lot of heavy reading.
A ton of it. But we're going to map out which countries are actually built to survive the next decade, and more importantly, why.
And to do that, we have to recognize a massive shift in perspective. Because for the last 70 years, we have essentially equated national strength with, like, GDP size.
Right.
Or military spending and a booming stock market. We've treated wealth and resilience as the exact same thing.
But our sources make a very compelling case that those metrics are just lagging indicators of current output, right?
Exactly. They tell us how much a country is producing right now, under perfect weather conditions.
Yeah.
But they do not measure a structural durability when the storm actually hits.
Okay, let's unpack this. Because for half a century, the rules of the game were pretty simple, weren't they?
Yeah, interdependence was the ultimate strategy.
Right. You plugged your economy into the global supply chain, you specialized in whatever you were best at, and you prospered.
But then, the pandemic happened.
Yeah.
And the sudden fracturing of U.S. and China trade, the energy shocks, all of that changed the rules almost overnight.
It really exposed the immense fragility of the whole system.
It did. We transitioned into an era where those old metrics of wealth are actually hiding massive vulnerabilities. Our sources hit us with a severe data reality check here.
I was reading this part, and it's bleak.
Yeah. As of March 2026, the IMF lists 9 countries already in debt distress and 23 more at high risk.
Wow.
And by the end of 2025, global debt hit a record $348 trillion.
$348 trillion. What does that even look like?
Well, it's a $29 trillion jump in just 1 year.
That's insane. It makes me think of how companies and countries have run these, just-in-time supply chains.
Right.
It's like a hospital running without a backup generator just to save money on diesel fuel. It looks incredibly efficient on a spreadsheet right up until the power grid goes down.
Exactly. The efficiency was the whole point.
But wait, I have to push back here for a second. Let's look at a massive, rich economy like Japan or the United States. Isn't that sheer wealth an inherent safety net?
You'd think so, right?
If you have enough money, can't you just buy your way out of a crisis?
Well, that assumption is exactly what the sources call the illusion of wealth. Let's look at the specific vulnerabilities of those rich nations you just mentioned.
Okay.
Japan has the world's 3rd largest economy, right? But they are carrying a debt-to-GDP ratio of approximately 230%.
230%?
Yeah. It is the highest of any major economy globally.
Wow.
And then look at Italy. They hold a permanent seat at the G7 table, but they ended 2025 owing 137.1% of their annual economic output to creditors.
So, practically speaking, what does carrying that much debt actually do to a country in a crisis?
It completely paralyzes them. When a crisis hits, a government needs to spend money, right? To subsidize energy, build infrastructure, or just support its citizens.
Yeah.
But when your debt is that high, every spare dollar you generate is already spoken for.
Because you're just paying off old bills.
Exactly. It's paying for the past, which means you have literally nothing left to invest in the future. The United States is perhaps the starkest example of this right now.
Oh, this was the stat that made me sit up in my chair.
Yeah, the data shows that in 2024, the U.S. crossed a historic and frankly alarming threshold.
What's the exact number again?
For the first time in modern history, the U.S. spent more on just the interest payments for its national debt, $879.9 billion, than it spent on its entire defense budget.
Which was what? 850 billion?
850.7 billion, yeah.
So you're spending more on the credit card interest than on the deadbolts for your doors.
Basically, yeah.
That is wild.
So if we connect this to the bigger picture, when a massive stress event hits, the critical question isn't who has the highest GDP.
Right.
The question is who is the most self-sufficient and the least leveraged. And when you look at the globe through that lens, you get two very different lists of winners and losers.
Which means we need a totally new way to measure a country. Because if wealth doesn't automatically equal survival, what does?
That's where the structural audit comes in.
Right. The audits we're reviewing lay out this fascinating 5-metric framework that actually determines a nation's durability.
It's essentially a structural audit of the world.
Based on 5 pillars of true resilience. And it all starts with the physical layer, which is energy and food.
Because when things get bad, the digital economy takes a backseat to the physical economy.
Oh, totally. You can't eat code.
Exactly. And the energy data in these reports is sobering. Out of 195 countries on Earth, only 13 are net energy exporters with a domestic surplus.
Wait, really? Just 13?
Just 13.
So only 13 countries actually produce more energy than they need to keep their own lights on?
Yes. That tier includes places like Norway, Canada, and Australia.
Okay.
But when you look at nations that aren't on that list, you see how fast wealth turns into a liability.
Like Germany.
Exactly. Take Germany. They are the EU's largest economy, an absolute industrial titan. But the analysis points to what it calls a massive unforced error over the past decade.
Right. They decommissioned their domestic nuclear capacity.
Yeah, while remaining heavily dependent on Russian gas.
And as we've seen, that wasn't just some economic miscalculation. It created a glaring geopolitical vulnerability. Because when someone else controls the switch to your factories, you aren't really in control of your own economy.
Exactly. Because energy self-sufficiency isn't just a commodity market anymore. It is a hard security consideration. And, the exact same logic applies to food.
Which is why the data on countries like Canada and Australia really stands out here.
Oh, absolutely.
The reports call it a dual surplus. Having a surplus in one area is great, but having it in both is incredibly rare.
It is. Like, Australia exports 70% of its agricultural output.
That's massive.
And Canada is a top 10 agricultural exporter. Plus, they hold the world's third largest proven oil reserves.
Think about that for a second. Having a massive built-in surplus in both the food your people eat and the energy you need to burn to move that food around.
It's an incredibly rare foundation.
It really is. The physical resources are only part of the equation, right? A country isn't just land and oil, it's people.
Right.
Which brings us to the second pillar, the human layer, demographics.
We are specifically looking at the ratio of productive workers to dependents here. And this ratio is determining the fiscal trajectory of entire continents in ways that GDP completely misses.
And the data on South Korea in these reports is just staggering.
Quite unprecedented, really.
Yeah, in 2023, their fertility rate hit a record low of 0.72. It edged up just slightly to 0.75 in 2024, but that is still the lowest fertility rate among all 38 OECD nations.
By a wide margin.
And their overall population has now been shrinking for a 5th consecutive year. But I want to pause here because it's easy to just throw out a number like 0.72. Mm-hmm. How does a shrinking population physically break a country's resilience?
Well, it acts like an immense structural anchor. Think about the mechanics of a modern economy, right? You need young, working-age people to manufacture goods, provide services, and critically pay the taxes that fund the state.
Right.
When your fertility rate collapses, you end up with a demographic inversion. And it's not just South Korea. Germany, Italy, Spain, they are all facing 20-year trajectories where their working-age populations are rapidly shrinking.
While their pension and healthcare obligations explode because of an aging population.
Exactly. You have fewer people generating economic output and exponentially more people requiring care and financial support.
And you can't just, innovate your way out of a sheer lack of human beings.
No, you can't. You need people to run your factories and hospitals. It drains the state's coffers and leaves absolutely no margin to respond to an external crisis.
Here's where it gets really interesting, though. we've talked about the physical resources and the human capital, but what about the glue that holds all of this together? Pillar number 3 is institutional stability.
Yes, the institutions.
Because when you read through these audits, you run into this bizarre paradox of resource-rich nations failing completely.
Institutions are the ultimate variable here. Institutional coherence means having, functioning courts, low corruption and effective bureaucracy, and public trust in governance.
The basics.
Right. If you don't have that, all the oil and wheat in the world will not save you. The sources use some stark historical parallels. Look at Argentina.
Yeah.
They have abundant agriculture, energy resources, and a highly educated population. Yet they have defaulted on their sovereign debt 9 times since independence.
9 times?
Yeah. And Venezuela has some of the most massive oil reserves on the planet, but their system completely collapsed.
Because the institutions couldn't actually manage the wealth.
Exactly.
But wait, let me play devil's advocate for a second. The reports contrast this with Rwanda. Rwanda has minimal natural resources to fall back on, yet through rigorous institutional reform and a huge focus on services, they had a GDP growth of 9.4% in 2025.
Right.
But Rwanda is tiny compared to a G7 nation. Does that kind of institutional model actually scale up to a massive superpower?
Well, it scales both ways, and that's the danger. A massive superpower can fail just as easily if the institutions rot. Look at the collapse of the USSR from 1989 to 1991. They had immense military might, massive industrial output, and boundless natural resources. But when public trust in the institutions evaporated and the bureaucracy gridlocked, the system failed incredibly rapidly. The critical variable isn't what you have. It's whether your institutions are capable of managing what you have.
Okay, so we have these core metrics: energy, food, debt, demographics, and institutions. But data is just data until someone interprets it, right?
Right.
So how do the leading geopolitical and economic minds actually look at this structural audit?
Well, there is a vibrant and sometimes fierce debate among the experts in our sources.
And just to be completely clear to you, the listener, we are impartially reporting these perspectives. Our sources contain very different ideological viewpoints on economics, some leaning toward free markets and others toward heavy state intervention.
Right.
We aren't taking sides here. We're just mapping out how different models view the exact same structural data.
Exactly. So on one end of the spectrum, you have the economist Nouriel Roubini.
Okay.
He looks at the combination of high debt, demographic contraction, and deglobalization, and he projects a highly bearish Greater Depression scenario.
A Greater Depression. Yikes.
Yeah. His focus is on how over-leveraged Western economies are. He argues that countries like Japan, Italy, and the U.S. simply cannot sustain their long-term fiscal trajectories without a massive structural reckoning.
But then you have Mariana Mazzucato offering a completely different lens. She's not just looking at the debt, she's looking at the state's ability to act.
Yes. Her argument is that state capacity and directed industrial policy are the real keys to resilience.
Okay, directed industrial policy. Let's define that for a second. That means the government isn't just sitting back and letting the free market do whatever it wants, right?
Yeah.
The government is actively choosing strategic sectors like semiconductors or green energy and aggressively directing capital and resources there to ensure the nation's survival.
Precisely. She points to places like South Korea and Taiwan as models for this.
Yeah.
Yes, South Korea has a severe demographic crisis, but Mazzucato argues their heavy institutional intervention and state-directed innovation produces a different kind of durability.
And then, adding a geopolitical layer to this, the reports bring in Ian Bremmer from the Eurasia Group. He introduces the concept of swing states.
Yeah, Bremer argues that resilience isn't just about what's inside your borders, it's about your structural optionality on the global stage.
Like how much room you have to maneuver?
Exactly. He identifies countries like Brazil, India, Saudi Arabia, and Turkey as these critical swing states. They have the resources and the strategic independence to avoid getting entirely locked into the U.S.-China bloc competition.
Oh, so they can trade with everyone.
Yes, which is a massive survival advantage.
So when you run every nation on Earth through this 5-metric framework and you layer on these expert analyses, it produces what the sources call a 3-tier resilience map. And this is where the rubber meets the road.
The world essentially fractures into 3 categories.
Yeah.
Tier 1 are the structurally durable nations. These countries combine at least 3 of the 5 metrics at a very high level.
And who is in this tier?
This is where we find Norway, Canada, Australia, Switzerland, and New Zealand. They have the institutional trust, the resources, and the fiscal space to absorb massive shocks.
Okay, then we have Tier 2. The data categorizes these as resilient under normal stress, but highly vulnerable under a systemic shock.
Right.
And this is where the heavyweights land, right? Germany, South Korea, the United States, Japan, the UAE. They have immense wealth, but glaring structural cracks in either their debt, their demographics, or their resources.
And finally, Tier 3. These are the structurally fragile nations with a high probability of severe crisis within the decade. This includes Argentina, Pakistan, Egypt, Italy, and, well, a significant portion of nations currently carrying IMF debt programs.
I want you to just take a second and picture where your own country falls on that map, because reading this, I realized this isn't just abstract economic theory. This has deeply personal stakes for every single person.
It really does. It completely dictates the reality of your daily life during a crisis. I mean, if you live in a Tier 1 country, your primary risk is mostly just the friction cost of a changing global order.
So prices might fluctuate, supply chains might slow down, but the foundation holds.
Right, the lights stay on.
All right.
But if you live in a Tier 2 country, your biggest risk is policy failure. Because the margins of error are so much thinner, you are incredibly vulnerable to the wrong government, making the wrong call at exactly the wrong moment.
And if you're in a Tier 3 country,
Well, the data suggests that for Tier 3, asset and residency diversification isn't just paranoia. It is completely rational risk management.
because the structural fragilities aren't theoretical anymore, they're already baked into the system.
Exactly.
So having mapped out exactly where the world is vulnerable, what does the data project is actually going to happen next? Our sources outline 3 very distinct scenarios for how the next decade unfolds.
The first is Scenario 1, which is mild stress. This is projected as the most likely path through 2030. We see continued slow growth, elevated borrowing costs, and maybe 3 to 5 sovereign restructurings, mostly among emerging markets.
And in this scenario, the Tier 1 high-resilience nations stay entirely stable, right?
The Tier 2 nations face friction, but they adapt.
Wait, for the listener who isn't a bond trader, what actually happens during a sovereign restructuring?
Well, it basically means a country goes to its international lenders and says, we literally do not have the money to pay you back on time. We need a discount, or we need an extension.
Yikes.
Yeah, and when that happens, the country's credit rating is destroyed. They can't borrow money to fund their government, which usually leads to massive domestic inflation and brutal cuts to public services.
So it's essentially a national bankruptcy proceeding.
Pretty much.
It's painful, but in Scenario 1, it's limited to a few vulnerable spots. Scenario 2, though, is a major recession. How does the data suggest that gets triggered?
The primary trigger could be a financial contagion event. The IMF's 2026 consultation explicitly flagged Japan's widening deficit as a risk here.
Okay.
Because the global economy is so intertwined, a sudden stress in the Japanese bond market, or perhaps a hard landing in China's economy, cascades through the global markets almost instantly.
And the audits are very specific about who gets hurt the most here.
Yes. In this scenario, countries with high external debt in foreign currencies face potential currency collapse.
Let's break that mechanism down, too. Why does it matter what currency the debt is in?
Because it creates a deadly trap. Imagine you are an emerging economy. You collect your taxes in your local currency, say pesos or lira.
Right.
But you borrowed money from international markets in U.S. dollars. If a global recession hits, investors panic and flock to the safety of the U.S. dollar.
So the dollar gets stronger.
Exactly. The dollar gets stronger, and your local currency plummets in value. Suddenly, without you borrowing a single extra cent, your debt has effectively doubled overnight because your local money buys fewer dollars.
Oh, man, it's a vicious cycle.
It really is.
Yeah.
Meanwhile, nations with domestic currency debt and strong resource surpluses are largely insulated from this. And crucially, the U.S. is constrained in how it can respond to this recession because, as we noted earlier, its massive debt interest payments severely limit its fiscal flexibility.
Which brings us to Scenario 3, the systemic shock.
Yeah.
This is the worst-case projection for the 2027 to 2032 window.
This is the convergence of multiple crises at once. It envisions a combination of major geopolitical conflict, perhaps in the Taiwan Strait or the Middle East, combined with a global energy price spike and simultaneous debt crises across 10 or more emerging markets.
So what does this all mean? If Scenario 3 hits, it feels like all those traditional financial metrics we've obsessed over for 70 years just, well, evaporate.
They do. They really do. In a true systemic shock, Having a high GDP or a strong stock market cannot heat your home or feed your population.
No.
Physical self-sufficiency, actually having your own food, energy, and water, and the institutional competence to distribute it becomes the absolute currency of survival. And this raises an important question, how do you actually prepare for a decade like that? Because you can't just guess what the specific crisis will be.
Right, you don't know if it's going to be a bond market collapse or a full-on war.
Exactly. The nations that will fare best aren't trying to predict one single catastrophe. They are aggressively building margins. They are creating buffers between themselves and the chaos.
So back to Norway.
Let's look at Norway one more time, yeah. During the 1973 oil shock, energy-importing nations suffered severe recessions. But Norway used that windfall of energy prices to build a sovereign wealth fund.
And it grew.
Oh, it grew. By the end of 2025, that fund hit $2.2 trillion.
$2.2 trillion for a population of 5 million people.
Yeah, that is about $390,000 for every single Norwegian citizen.
Yeah.
They didn't just spend the wealth on current output, they built a structural margin that protects them from almost any financial shock you can imagine.
They reinforced the foundation instead of just adding more glass to the penthouse.
That's a great way to put it.
And that's really the ultimate takeaway from this entire stack of audits. Resilience is a structure. It is not an event.
Right.
The map of who survives the next decade already exists right now in the data. We have the numbers on food, on energy, on debt, and demographics. The only question is whether you are in the right place on that map when the ground starts shaking.
And as we close, I want to leave you with one final, very specific data point from our sources to mull over on your own.
Let's hear it.
According to the USGS Critical Minerals List, in 2024, the United States imported 80% of the rare earth elements it used. 80%.
And just for context, those are the elements required for virtually all modern technology, right? We're talking smartphones, electric vehicles, and, well, highly advanced defense systems.
Exactly. So if that worst-case systemic shock scenario actually arrives and global trade fractures entirely, how does a Tier 2 superpower defend itself or even function when it doesn't possess the physical ingredients required to build its own technology?
Wow. It's a question of whether the building can stand when the supply trucks stop coming. Thank you for joining us on this deep dive. Keep looking past the facade, and we'll see you next time.